Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am happy to be with you on this 400th episode of the podcast. I cannot believe it is the 400th episode. When I started this, I never thought I would make it this far. But here we are, 400th episode, and I just looked. It's the 312th interview I've done. Whew, that is crazy. Thank you so much for being with me on this crazy journey. I am grateful, as always, for you, my listeners, and I hope that you are having a good week. Hope your weekend was good. My husband has had a cold for the past week, 10 days, so he's been really miserable, and my allergies, I don't know if it's my cold or if he gave me his allergies, but I've been really, really tired. But over the weekend, I had a fun yet strange experience. A friend of mine has another friend who has moved here, and she is trying to get outdoor shots for her photography portfolio. And so she asked my friend and her husband if they wanted a short photo shoot, and they said yes. And then my friend asked us if we wanted the same, and I thought, oh, that would be fun. And so we were going to go and take the dogs and just have a fun little quick photo shoot on the beach. Very cool. Well, then hubby has been sick. He was miserable, and he also didn't want to share germs with anyone. And then our boy dog was being just an absolute jerk. He was so just in a mood that day. So everyone stayed home, and I went to the photo shoot by myself. I'm not a model. I'm not keen on being the center of attention. And so she says, okay, so just don't just stand there, act natural, do something, but make it look natural. And I was like, oh my gosh, if you say act natural, I'm like a preschooler in school photos, where they make that like totally weird grin that is in no way natural. But it went well. It was nice to be outside. It was nice to hang out with my friends and to meet some new people. It was a beautiful day, and the pictures turned out nice. There's a couple that I really, really like. My hubby says they're great. My mom says they're great, so I guess I have to listen to them. But just not what I was really expecting to do over the weekend. And that was right after I interviewed Anthony, who is today's author. That I went from interviewing to beach photography or photo shoot. Sounds like such a glamorous life, doesn't it? At any rate, that is my guest today. Anthony McGowan is joining me to talk about his book for youngsters, not quite middle grade, a little younger than middle grade, but a book for many ages. It is called Dogs of the Deadlands. Let me go ahead and give you the description of this book. Chernobyl, 1986. Natasha's world is coming to an end. Forced to evacuate her home in the middle of the night, she must leave her puppy behind and has no idea if she'll ever return. Sometime later, growing up in the shadow of the ruined nuclear power plant, pups Misha and Braytan need to learn how to live wild and fast. Creatures with sharp teeth, claws, and yellow eyes lurk in the overgrown woods, and they're watching the brothers' every move. That is the description of Dogs of the Deadlands. Amazon, I'm looking right now, lists the reading ages 10 years and up. I think Anthony says 9 to 12 years. But, you can read it with your kids. If your younger kids like books with a lot of action that might be a little on the scary side for them, but you know your children, you know your little ones, so you would know what age they might like. I will say, my sister, our whole lives, has always said, no, I will not watch a movie where the animal is the main character, because something bad always happens to that animal, whether or not they die. It's always traumatizing. She won't do it. And I totally get her point, right? We sometimes we care so much for animals, it's hard to see them in dangerous situations. Even harder sometimes, I think, than seeing some of our favorite human characters in dangerous situations, because animals just seem so pure and innocent at times. And so this book is fast-paced. It is told from a little bit from Natasha's point of view, but also from Misha's point of view. And we get a lot of Misha and Braytan's lives as puppies growing up in the wilderness. And it's the wilderness. It's after a major, major disaster in that wilderness. And so there are dangerous situations, and it can be intense sometimes. I thought it was very well done in terms of showing the danger and the intensity without going overboard. So like I said, you would know your child. I think as a child, I might not have I think I would have cried. And that's not a bad thing. This book, because I fell in love with the animals as an adult, I definitely would have fell in love with the animals as a child. But Misha and Braytan have all kinds of adventures, fun adventures, as well as the scarier adventures, and we get to watch them throughout that whole life. And we also get to follow Natasha a little bit as she goes from a 7-year-old in 1986, when this disaster forces her and her family to leave their home, to leave their pet in the middle of the night, and we get to follow her life and see how that all impacts her. So I really liked the perspective from both Misha's point of view, the dog's point of view, and also from the human's point of view, and just the differences. And of course, obviously, there's going to be differences in those storylines, but tying those two together, juxtaposing them against one another, I thought was very well done. At any rate, as you know, the book is called Dogs of the Deadlands. The author is Anthony McGowan. Let's go ahead and go to the interview so Anthony can talk more about this book. Hi, Anthony. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here so far.
Well, we're off to a good start then. I'm happy to have you here, and we're going to talk about your book, Dogs of the Deadlands. But before we do that, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, as you can tell, I'm English. I was born in the north of England, but now I live in London in the south. 58 years old, married with 2 grown-up kids now. I suppose you want to hear about my life as a writer. I was trying to count up how many books I've written in my quite long career now, and I lost count somewhere in between kind of 48 and 52. So it's quite a lot of books. I've written books for adults. I've written fiction and non-fiction for adults, also books for quite small children. But most of my books, I guess, are YA or teen literature, or a little bit younger. So that's me in my career. Do you think 50 books too many? Should I stop now? I probably should, shouldn't I?
No, I think you should write until you just don't have any stories left in you.
Until I drop down dead, maybe then.
That seems a little dramatic, but if that's,
didn't it?
There are worse ways to go. As I said, the book is called Dogs of the Deadlands. Can you give an overview of that story?
Yeah, sure. Well, it begins on a particular date, which is unusual for my books, which was April the 26th, 1986, which was the day on which the Chernobyl nuclear plant exploded, or reactor number 4 exploded, spreading nuclear contamination, radiation over quite a wide area. The people had to be evacuated. And once the people were evacuated from the area, animals kind of moved in. So the whole area was rewilded. And that's a kind of background to it. But also that when the people were evacuated, they were told to be back in a week or so. And that they had to leave their pets behind, their dogs and their cats. But the people, of course, never came back to the local town, in particular, Pripyat. And so my story is about a particular puppy left behind called Zoya, and her struggles to survive in this growing up in this exciting wilderness. And so it partly follows Zoya's life and the life of her own puppies, but also then keeps tabs on the little girl, Natasha, who was given Zoya for her 7th birthday on the same night that the plant blew up. So essentially, it's kind of these two strands of the narrative: one following the life of the dogs, and one following Natasha's life as she grows up.
Mm-hmm. And I assume your initial inspiration is pretty clear with what happened to the animals after Chernobyl. But what prompted that idea for you to be like, you know what, there's a story in there, especially from the perspective of both animals and humans? What prompted that inspiration?
Yeah, well, what originally fired my imagination was there was a documentary on the TV about the rewilding of the area, and there was one particular shot. It was a National Geographic documentary, a particular shot of a pack of wolves that had occupied a deserted farmhouse or farmstead, and one particular wolf kind of jumped on an outbuilding and then onto the top of the farmhouse and howled in a kind of classic, almost cliched wolf-like manner. But in the background, you could just make out the ruined nuclear plant, and that juxtaposition of the natural and the domestic and the wild and the ruined plant. I thought, okay, that just really got me thinking. And then I actually read another article, I think also in the National Geographic magazine, about the dogs that had been left behind. And so some managed to survive, 30 years later, but most of them survived by scavenging off the humans who were still working in the new ruined plant. So those were the two kind of inspirations for the animal side of the story, of the rewilding process, and also the dogs that somehow managed to survive in that wilderness. And then I suppose I wanted a human angle to the story as well. So we follow Natasha's life, which is not a particularly happy one. So she had one glorious night with her puppy Zoya, where I know you're a dog owner, as am I. But that she forms that instant bond of love with her new puppy, takes it to bed, and that's when the catastrophe happens, and they're pulled apart. So for all of her life, there's this little puppy-shaped hole in her heart. And although she's clever and successful, she never quite heals. And I wanted to find a way of, I suppose, bringing her together again in some way with that beautiful thing that she'd lost. So that was the human driver in the story.
Yeah, and you really just had to rip out our heartstrings with the beginning of that story, didn't you? Because literally, she gets the dog for her 7th or 8th birthday, and then that's it, one night.
Yeah, exactly. And I also tried to, being a writer, I'm a appallingly cruel person, a terrible person, and I derive immense pleasure from upsetting people and making them cry. So I also, at the end, I tried to have one of those kind of sad, happy, tearful endings, because it's what makes me happy, making other people sad.
What makes me happy. Therapy. No, I'm kidding. Oh my goodness, that was so rude of me to just suggest therapy, and now we're going to a break. But of course, I was just kidding. I have nothing against therapy. I think everyone should go to therapy, but not in this case. That was just me being silly. Hopefully everyone understands that. But we are going to take that first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about writing from not only the human perspective, from Natasha's perspective, but also from Misha's perspective, from that of the dog in the story. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Anthony McGowan about his book, Dogs of the Deadlands. Let's go ahead and return to that interview.
You've mentioned that it is written mainly from the point of view of the dog, but also you get Natasha's story in there as well. So can you talk about writing from both of those perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I guess now it's probably 2/3 the animal story to 1/3 Natasha's, or maybe even more skewed towards the animals. I mean, actually, in the original draft of it, there was slightly more of the human side of that equation. I had two big digressions, which probably slightly, I don't know. There were some of the best things I've ever written, but they slightly distorted the book, I think. So they had to go kill your darlings, as I say. Yeah, I mean, my main goal with the animal story was just to make it utterly gripping and exciting. So that part of the story is just filled with violence and fight and danger and chase scenes. I wanted that the reader to be, that sensation you have when you're reading a book that you're really loving, where you can't turn the pages fast enough to find out what happens. So it's meant to be a really gripping, thrilling adventure story. And I suppose, but there's also an emotional core in there, in that most of that part of the story follows the two puppies of Zoya, Misha and Bratan. And Bratan has, I suppose, is disabled because of the effects of the radiation. So Misha kind of is his carer in a sense. So that kind of bond between those two brothers is the emotional core of that story. And around that, you get all the hopefully exciting kind of scenes. So that was that side. On the other side, I suppose it's all about Natasha's sadness and how she can somehow find a way of healing, which I think happens at the end. So, but yeah, I mean, in terms of what I was trying to achieve, on the one side, I wanted just this utterly gripping wilderness adventure, but also I wanted to have that emotional core, I suppose, on both sides.
In terms of kind of the excitement level and for Misha and Braytan, a lot does happen to them. Do you have readers or an editor who reads that and says, maybe you've gone too far with the excitement level for the age group that you're aiming at, or do you kind of police that yourself?
Well, I suppose that there's no limit to how much excitement you can cram into a book, especially for younger readers. I suppose the only area in which you might feel restricted is to do with the level of violence and the level of gore. And I thought I'd get more of a pushback from my editor than I actually got on that, because it is quite gory and visceral. I suppose I should explain that the dogs have got to survive in this rewilded environment, and they're kind of big enemies really of the wolves. And a lot of the kind of action concerns that the dogs battling against the wolves. And a lot of those kind of fight scenes are that I just try to make them as utterly compelling and gripping and gory and grueling as I possibly could. Although in that, I actually took my lead from a couple of books by Jack London, which I read as a school kid, and I kind of revisited them as part of the process of thinking about this book. It's Call of the Wild and White Fang, and I'd completely forgotten how incredibly gory that they are. They're brutal books, wonderfully brutal books, and so I wanted to capture some of that Jack London kind of brutality and realism, and I wanted to make these books feel real, not at all saccharine, or there was no soft focus on those animal interactions at all. But no, so excitement, I think, I don't think anyone would ever complain about too much excitement in a book. But the gore, I pushed that, I think, as far as I could.
Mm-hmm. And I will say that it's been about 30 years since I've read Jack London. And we had to read those in high school, and I hated them, and I did not hate this story. So you've done good. At least maybe it's the 30 years intervening in there, but I enjoyed this much better than I enjoyed the dogs in those stories.
It's really worth revisiting London. He's a fantastic writer, and I do think, again, he turns both those dials up to the maximum: the excitement and also that kind of the gore. I think he's one of my writing heroes, Jack London.
Yeah. What age group do you think will respond best to the story?
It's a really hard question. So, as I said earlier, most of my books are aimed at teenagers and young adults. And this is, I suppose, targeted a bit younger than that. That kind of, I suppose it's being sold in the UK as a book for 9 to 12-year-olds. But I actually think it's probably a book aimed at older children than that. So I'm kind of hoping that almost anyone could enjoy this. And in fact, most of the adults I've come across, most of the readers I've come across have been adults who, the kind of adults who like this sort of animal adventure. So I guess I'm really hoping it appeals to pretty much everyone. Although I'd certainly say that it's not suitable for children younger than 9. I think it's just too dark for really small children.
Right. Yeah, definitely not something to read before bed with small children.
No.
Yeah. And then what do you hope that readers might take away from the story?
So my central goal as an author is always to entertain the reader. But I give as wide a definition to entertain as I possibly could. I'm trying to stimulate, frighten, amuse, educate in some ways the reader. So essentially, I wanted them to care about the characters and really to want to find out what happens to them. But also along the way to feel those intense emotions that you feel when you're reading a book that you're really loving. I suppose I had as well as a secondary kind of goal that aim to explain that world to them, both the fascinating rewilding of that environment and something of the background to the disaster. But essentially, what I wanted the reader to do was just to be loving this book and to be desperate to find out what happens next.
Okay. And I often ask about character development. How, for you as the author, was developing animal characters different, if at all, from developing your human characters? Like, what did you put into kind of thinking about those characters as opposed to some of the human characters?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it was very, very hard not to anthropomorphize those dogs and the wolves. And I did that a little bit. I mean, a lot of the books that I loved as a younger reader, books like Watership Down, and those kind of animal adventures where the animals are kind of basically humans. I was trying to push against that a little bit, and I wanted to make it as naturalistic as I possibly could. But I wanted to take the readers inside the heads of those animal characters. And so it was impossible not to make them a little bit human in their emotions and ways of interacting. But what I didn't give them was language, or occasionally there'll be a kind of translation of a dog bark into a yes or a no, that kind of thing, but they don't speak in elaborate speeches. But also I follow my main central point of view dog character, Misha, all the way through his life, from being a puppy to being a very old dog. And so I wanted the reader to go on that journey with that dog. So obviously the character develops. It begins as a little naive puppy and ends as a grumpy old guard dog, I suppose. So I suppose in terms of development, the development was just the course of that dog's life and the things that happened to it. So that was the kind of character development there. It was almost the interaction of that animal with the events that occur in its life. With on the human side, you can be more complicated with the psychology. So Natasha begins a very normal little child. This terrible thing happens to her, but both being torn away from her puppy, but also being torn away from her world, from the small town where she was brought up, put into this alien city, and never quite putting down roots anywhere. So that was her journey. But I suppose, again, whenever I'm thinking about a character, I tend to begin just with that moment in time when the story begins, and their character then organically develops with the plot. So you don't have a fixed idea of what the character. I don't, as an author. You have just a little kind of seed-like concept of what that character might be, but you never quite know how it's going to fully flower or develop.
Fair enough. Yeah. How about research? Obviously, you needed to know a little bit about Chernobyl and the aftermath and the animals that survived that. But what kinds of research did you do for the story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, with almost all my other books, basically the research was remembering. I was thinking back to stuff that happened to me when I was at high school or whatever. But this is very different. This involved just so much research. I wanted to get it exactly right. So that was both into the nature of the original disaster. Then I read every single scientific paper available about the rewilding process, about exactly what happened to the wildlife there, about the levels of contamination, the kind of big herbivores that came in first, animals like bison, European bison, moose and the deer, also the predators that followed those, lynx and wolves and bears. So I just read everything about that. But the most important research for me was about the relationship between dogs and wolves. So once again, I hunted down every single scientific paper about this. And it was, genuinely fascinating. Perhaps almost too fascinating. I think there's various dangers as an author. There's different ways of putting off the actual writing process, and research can be one of those excuses that you use to avoid actually sitting down and typing. But yeah, so I obsessively looked into wolf behavior, read every paper about that, and about dogs and wolves interacting in the wild. It's probably worth explaining to listeners now that basically dogs and wolves are the same species. They can fully interbreed, have fertile young, which is the definition of being the same species. But they've drifted apart in evolutionary terms. So there's things that wolves can do that dogs just can't anymore. And also I read lots of papers about this interaction between dogs and wolves. And it never normally ends well for the dogs. Essentially, if a dog meets a wolf, it can go one of two paths, and 99 times out of 100 the wolf will just kill and eat the dog, and it generally doesn't even take a minute. It takes seconds for this to happen, and the only chance that a dog will have of not being wolf dinner is if it's a daddy wolf and a mummy dog and they become special friends, as I try to explain to school children. That I suppose is floating in the background. It's why my puppies have managed to survive, because they're half wolf.
Right.
So yeah. So I steeped myself in the research, both because it was fascinating, but also because it's easier than writing.
Yeah, I would imagine. But it does sound fascinating.
You probably noticed that I did just cut myself off mid-thought, not mid-thought, but kind of in a segue. It will make more sense, hopefully, when we come back from break. But to the point that Anthony just made, it's easier than writing. Maybe. It's probably all relative, right? Like maybe writing some days seems really, really, really hard compared to some other things. And maybe sometimes it seems vastly easier than doing other things. I don't know. It's got to just depend, right? At any rate, let's go ahead and take our second break of this episode. When we come back, more with Anthony. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Again, I am speaking with author Anthony McGowan about his book, Dogs of the Deadlands. I'm going to give away, spoiler alert, like in the next 10 seconds, spoiler alert. So Anthony makes a comment and I completely jump over his comment while I'm trying to finish my thought. And he says, I mentioned Montana, he says wolf country. and I just jump right over that. Yes, Montana does have wolves. They've had a very successful process of reintroducing wolves back into especially Yellowstone National Park. That comes with pros and cons, of course, but yes, there are wolves in my home state, and I just jumped right over that comment. So I'm answering that preemptively, but also in 3 days later after the interview. Let's go ahead and get back to the interview.
I mentioned before we were recording that I grew up in Montana in the United States, which is
wolf country.
Yeah, but I wasn't expecting bison in this particular story, considering where it took place. So that was interesting.
Yeah, well, the European bison is very closely related to the American bison stroke buffalo, but they are separate species. And they're slightly different behaviors than the American bison.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things that particularly fascinated me was the kind of history of wolf research itself. Because some of the original research on wolves was looking at wolf packs in zoos in Europe in particular. And that's where the whole idea of a kind of alpha male and female came from. So, you'd have the two main male and females, and then a strict hierarchy beneath them with, the omega wolves at the bottom. And then from the 1970s, when people started to look at wolf behavior in the wild as opposed to in zoos or domestic settings, found that didn't seem to quite work. That basically wolf packs in Europe, where most of the early research was done, were basically just a family. So a mother and a father, the pups from the previous generation, and one more generation of pups. And so that way of looking at wolves packs as being dominated by an alpha and a alpha male and female, then the hierarchy went out of fashion. But then more recently, when people have studied wolves in America, where again you get these much kind of bigger wolf packs in places like Yellowstone, in fact, that kind of idea of an alpha male and female has almost had a resurgence. And it's almost kind of tracking different ideological trends in the wider society. So maybe in the 1930s, that strict hierarchy kind of appealed to some people. And then later on, the 70s, that kind of fell out of fashion, but now maybe it's back in fashion again. So yeah, so in my book, I do use the terminology of alpha male and female, but hopefully in a way that doesn't necessarily imply that strict hierarchy, but just the two main male and females in the pack. I call alpha and male and female. Mm-hmm. So that's a slight digression there. I apologize. It's still in my head, all this research.
No, I get it. And actually, I've read some of those same, or I've heard a lot of those same studies in terms of. Wow, my dog just sneezed really loud. Sorry.
I heard that was a dog sneeze. That's useful.
I've read some of those or heard some of those same studies of, the alpha. Is there a strict alpha? Is there not? It's kind of, been debated for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a terminology thing. That do you call it the male and the female, or do you call it the alpha male and the alpha female?
Are there any other writing you've written? You said 50 books, so we can't talk about all of them. But are there any writings or books that you would like to highlight?
Well, I was pondering this the other day, and in fact, it turns out that in almost all of my books, there's a kind of animal theme that runs through them. I'm probably best known in the UK for a series of books I wrote about two brothers in a very difficult situation, and been brought up in poverty in the north of England. These books called Brock, Pike, Rook, and Lark. And although they're focused on the human side of the story, there's always a kind of animal theme that goes through it. And I've also written a series of straightforward kind of animal books, I suppose. I don't know if Willard Price is still a big writer in the United States. Is he still a big name?
Potentially, I'm not sure actually.
He was a huge writer for young people from the 50s all the way through the 70s, and that kind of fell out of favor.
Yeah.
But again, he wrote books about two teenagers traveling the world, collecting animals to sell to zoos. So kind of,
okay.
And the early ones, the first book's called Amazon Adventure, and in that the two brothers go into the Amazon jungle to collect animals, but they want a baby anteater. So what do? You kill the parents to get the baby to sell to zoos. So it's they're kind of quite brutal. They become slightly more ecologically aware later on. But anyway, a few years ago, I was employed to continue the series. So I wrote about the next generation. So I wrote 4 books, which are about 2 teenagers traveling the world, protecting animals. So I suppose they're the nearest things to this particular book. One's called Leopard Adventure and Bear Adventure, which is set in Canada. Python adventure set in India. So they're again animal focused. Although again, it's more about the humans protecting the animals than from the animal point of view.
I can definitely see why that author would have kind of fallen out of circulation quite so much if that's the case of let's just eliminate the parents. Not a big deal.
Yeah.
No. And are you working on anything new currently?
Well, I was kind of working on a sort of, not a sequel, but a follow-up to the Dogs of the Deadlands, set in a similar kind of world. And for the first time in my quite long career, I suddenly realized, 15,000 words into it, that it wasn't quite working. So I've had to abandon it, which is a terrible blow for any, 6 months work down the drain. But I think sometimes that's going to happen in a writer's life. You just realize that original idea wasn't quite strong enough or as strong as you thought it was. So, literally last week, I decided I couldn't carry on with that.
Oh,
so
wow.
now I'm in that very rare period for me of just trying to, do some blue sky thinking.
Yeah. Well, you never know. Maybe it doesn't work at all, or maybe sometime down the road you think of a way to reimagine it or something.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep.
Yeah.
Who knows?
You've written a lot, obviously. Is it something that you always wanted to do, even from when you were a kid, or how did you come to decide to write for publication?
Yeah, well, I guess by my mid-teens, I'd kind of reached that point where I realized that I quite enjoyed writing, whether just essays at school or creative writing stuff. And I began to write terrible poetry to try and impress girls. Never worked. But I knew that language was my thing. So I began to think that I might have a life where I had a job and then wrote on the side. I kind of planned that. And I spent a lot of time at university. So my big life plan was to become a university lecturer in philosophy, was my kind of academic subject, and then write one literary novel a decade. But I never quite got the job in a university. I had various sort of not very interesting jobs. And so the very first book I wrote was a book called Hellbent, which is about a teenage boy who in the first chapter dies and goes to hell. A sort of retelling of Dante's Inferno. I wasn't even sure what kind of book it was. I didn't know if it was an adult book or a teenage book. But eventually that got published. I did have another job on, my day job then, but just gradually the kind of writing took over. And after a few years, I was able to focus full time on it. But no, so mine wasn't the kind of life that you could really plan, I suppose. Or is any life the kind of life you can plan? But insofar as I had a plan, it didn't work out.
Mm-hmm. Well, it worked out in a different way, so that's good.
Oh, maybe.
I just met you, so I can't judge. What do you think draws you to writing books geared for, the younger end of the population?
Well, I think a lot of that is to do with the kind of experience that I had when I was a teenager. So I was brought up in the north of England. I went to school in a city called Leeds in the north of England, which is a kind of quite a working class sort of place. And I went to a particularly tough school where, every single day was full of conflict and violence and fear and tension, anxiety and love and hate. So all the things, I suppose, that fiction's made out of. And so, years later, when I did start thinking about my first book, my mind would always drift back to those intense, passionate, dangerous teenage years. And that's what I began to write about. So it just seems to me like an endlessly fertile area for fiction, that kind of YA teenage years. So my first 3 or 4 books were teenage books. But then I began to have children, and that sort of pulled me back to write for slightly younger people. And that, but again, exploiting the kind of memories and experiences I had when I was a younger child. But I suppose I'm slightly unusual in that I really have written for, everyone. I've not yet written one of those kind of quilted books that babies wipe their drool on with a picture of a carrot on every page. But apart from that, I've literally done everything. And I'm maybe that's a bad idea. I've never quite focused on any one area of publication. So before Dogs of the Deadland, my last book was a non-fiction book about philosophy. Again, it's got a dog in the title. It's called How to Teach Philosophy to Your Dog. which is about me and my little dog Monty, who's not here today. He's off having adventures. It's us wandering around North London talking about philosophy. So, which couldn't really be further away from my kind of YA or younger fiction.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe I should focus in the future, work out what I'm good at.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a possibility, but it seems to be working for you so far to not have a specific genre.
Muddling through.
Yeah. And what type of a philosopher is Monty?
Well, he's quite Socratic. His job is just to ask questions and expose areas of ignorance. So it's kind of it's an introduction to philosophy, but aimed at adults, but I suppose also younger people might enjoy it. But
Sure.
we go through all the great topics of philosophy with him asking questions and me trying to answer them. Well, it's also it's a story about a man and his dog as well.
Yeah.
So what kind of dog do you have?
I have Chihuahuas, 2 of them.
Oh, okay. That's a similar level of macho-ness to my dog then. I've got a little white fluffy Maltese Terrier.
Yeah. The boy dog is convinced everyone is here to murder us. So we get a lot of false bravado on his part, but he's also scared of snacks. So
scared of snacks. Okay,
he's scared of snacks. Yeah, he can't catch to save his life. And my husband threw a peanut to him one day and it hit him in the forehead, and so now he actively runs from peanuts. And he's scared of beef jerky. I don't know why.
But moving on. Yes, actually, moving on to our final break of this episode, and I'm laughing because I had kind of forgotten that we'd had that conversation about Chalupa, the boy dog, being scared of everything, and then I made that comment about him being a jerk at the beginning of the episode, so I'm really putting him in a bad light. He's a very, very sweet little puppy when he wants to be, and sometimes he's a very grumpy old man when he wants to be, so he's a puppy. He's 9, he's not a puppy, but you know what I mean. He's a puppy of many facets. At any rate, when we come back, Anthony will be sharing his advice for aspiring authors. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Anthony McGowan.
From your experience as an author, do you have advice for someone aspiring to write?
Oh gosh, I suppose I do, but it's almost a kind of cliched one that, you know, writers come in all different shapes and sizes. We all have our own idiosyncrasies. We're all eccentric and weird in our own ways. But the one thing we all have in common is that we begin by being readers. So, you know, I honestly believe that every writer creates as a kind of weird product of reading. So the reading and the writing are intertwined. It's a really brilliant book that I just finished. The George Saunders book, which is, what's it called? It's a Swim in the Pond in the Rain, where he looks at a series of Russian short stories, which are all read, which he all part of the book, and then talks about them. And just that beautiful interaction with other text is fantastically fertile. So I think that's the key for being a writer is to first of all is to learn how to read like a writer. So whenever you read a text, try and work out exactly how it's achieved the effects that it has. You know, what works, what doesn't work. So that intense involvement with other texts, I think, makes you a better writer. So there's that. when I talk about this with other writers, it seems that we fall into two different camps as well. There are the kind of writers who think that that the creative process is purely internal, that it's almost like laying an egg. The process is between you and your imagination and your own voice, and then you sort of present this beautiful egg to the world. I almost think it's like when you have a toddler and you're potty training them, and they sit on their potty, they produce it, they show it to the world. See, I've done a poo, Ma, I did a poo. And so that's that internal self-centered way of looking at writing, and obviously a lot of the greatest writers work in exactly that kind of way, but I prefer a different paradigm of writing, which is it's more like an active communication. So I actually always think about my readers. I'm thinking, am I gripping you here? Am I boring you? Am I amusing you? Am I exciting you? And that helps me. It helps me to think about having that reader. In fact, maybe that's partly because I often write for younger people, and so I can't simply write for myself because I'm not a 14-year-old person. I'm a late middle-aged person, so I've got to imagine myself into that reader's mind as part of that creative process. So yeah, that was all kind of jumble, wasn't it? So my two tips are: one, interact creatively with other texts, and that will make you a better writer. And my second one is that, personally for me, thinking about the reader and their response to what I'm producing is also, I think, helpful.
Mm-hmm. I kind of now want you to write something titled "I've Done a Poo." I mean, you can determine what that is.
I have written quite a lot of sort of toilet humor stuff for younger children. So, sure. In fact, even a lot of my teenage books are there's a certain amount of what I'd term body comedy in them.
Oh yeah, well,
not so much in Dogs of the Deadland, but my other YA stuff it can be quite graphically amusing, I hope.
A little vomit, but it's not comical vomit in Dogs of the Deadland.
Well, someone did once write a review of my books that mucus is to McGowan what daffodils were to Wordsworth. So perhaps there's some truth in that.
It could be worse.
Could be.
So you were talking about reading. When you read for yourself rather than for research or writing in general, who are your go-to authors and genres?
Well, it does change. But certainly whatever I'm reading feeds into what I'm writing. But so, but back when I was younger, when I was first starting to read, I was massively into Tolkien. So when I was quite a small child, I just, in a typical horrible boy manner, I read non-fiction about war and about animals. and still probably a third of what's in my head comes from those early obsessions with war and animals. But then when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, a teacher gave me The Lord of the Rings. It was the first real work of fiction I'd ever read, and it was a big struggle for someone like me. It took me maybe 2 or 3 years to read it, but that definitely formed me as a reader and perhaps even as a writer, reading The Lord of the Rings. But for the past couple of decades, I've been a bit of a Cormac McCarthy obsessive. I've read literally every word he's ever written. So maybe there's a bit of his kind of visceral, kind of gripping complexity in some of my books as well. A bit of that seeps into Dogs of the Deadlands. So he's probably my kind of current go-to author. But I don't like to restrict myself really to genre. It's more, individual authors I'll follow, but not genres. As a younger reader, I went through all of Stephen King, but I'm not particular horror reader or writer. So that's my approach. I follow authors rather than genres.
And not all of Stephen King is horror. So there's other things
very true
as well.
True.
How about internet presence? If you have a website, if you can tell people how to find that, as well as any social media that you're active on. Yeah,
well, there's an AnthonyMcGowan.com. Mispronounced my own name there. It's an AnthonyMcGowan.com website, but it's not particularly well updated in the way of things now. I suppose my big commitment social media wise has always been to Facebook, which for 12 years now I've used as a kind of writer's journal. In fact, one of my books is called The Art of Failing, which is kind of my Facebook posts, but that are just jazzed up a bit. So I downloaded my Facebook archive a few years ago, and it was 500,000 words that I'd written there. And I did wonder if there was a kind of book in there. So I sort of shaped it and adapted it and expanded some bits and cut other bits. So The Art of Failing is essentially me on Facebook, contemplating the mundanity and glory of everyday life. So yeah, Facebook is where I live. I've also been strongly encouraged by my publishers to tweet as much as possible. So there's quite a lot of McGowan on Twitter as well. What I don't so much do are the things the kids do, the Instagram and TikTok. I'm just too old for that.
I understand. There's a lot of them, and they keep coming.
Yeah.
Yes. We've covered a variety of different things during our time together, but is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would especially like to highlight at this time?
Oh, blimey. I did think about that before we started, and I think you've sucked me dry. There's nothing left to give. I'm sorry, Sarah.
Wow. Now I'm like an interviewing vampire.
But I suppose all I would say is that I think that I was trying to work out why read Anthony McGowan as opposed to any of the other really great writers, both for young people and for adults. But I don't think there's anyone like me. I think particularly a lot of my YA stuff, it's not like any other YA. You can't say it's a bit like X or a bit like Y. It's pretty much unique. I suppose in a lot of my books, this kind of combination of kind of graphic comedy of the human body, that kind of stuff, but also with that other layers of philosophy and kind of linguistic complexity. So if I've got one prime selling point, I think it's I'm just not like anybody else at all. That sounds quite un-English, that as a kind of boastful claim. I am unique. Whereas obviously we English people are by nature modest and self-deprecating. So I may be terrible, but I'm terrible in my own unique way. Will that do?
Well, there you go. I think you found a balance between self-promotion and being English. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about Dogs of the Deadlands and writing. I really appreciate it.
No, that really was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you once again to Anthony for joining me to talk about Dogs of the Deadlands and to be the guest on this 400th episode. I think that's pretty cool. As I said at the beginning of this episode, I am grateful for you, my listeners, for sticking with me and hanging out to hear from so many authors. And I'm grateful to all of those authors who have joined me for their episodes of this podcast. I have learned so much from everyone I've talked to, and I have read so many authors that I never would have read before. So I'm very, very grateful for the entire experience. But thank you again to Anthony. And if you have kids of many ages, you might want to check out Dogs of the Deadlands or some of Anthony's other books. As I said, this could make your kiddo cry if they are sensitive, but that's just because the dogs are getting into stuff as dogs do when they live in the wild, and they're going to have adventures. And so you might have an adventurous kiddo who loves these kinds of stories, and you may have a sensitive kiddo who loves these kinds of stories. At any rate, you're going to know your kiddo's preferences. And if they love animals and they love animal stories, you should definitely check this out. And maybe it's something you want to read with your children of different ages. Maybe it's something they want to read on their own. All good options. But definitely check out this and any other of Anthony's books that sound like they might be interesting to you or your children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews or, whatever children you have in your life that you like to buy books for. I hope you will join me for the next episode, which will be on Friday this week. Had 2 interviews this week, so we'll have a Friday episode. I will be speaking with author Mary T. Ford about her book, Boy at the Crossroads, From Teenage Runaway to Class President. I don't want to give too much away, but the teenage runaway had quite the adventures at 13. You're just going to have to tune in to hear more. Please join me for that episode on Friday. And as always, if you are a fan of this podcast, please leave a review, written or starred. Either way helps get this podcast out to more listeners. Make sure you're liking, subscribing, following, whatever options are available on the platform that you listen on so you know when new episodes come out. And also follow us. Me and the podcast, I don't know. Follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Thank you in advance for any and all of those things that you may choose to do. I hope you're having a great week. I hope you had a good weekend. Maybe it had an adventure of something you never expected to find yourself doing, as did mine. But whatever you're doing, whether it is unexpected adventure or simply doing your usual day-to-day routine, I hope that you always have time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.